You know how people always say, trust your gut? Well, they're absolutely right. I didn't trust mine that night, and I'll probably regret it for the rest of my life. It was late December, just before New Year's, and the snowstorm was relentless, the kind that buries everything under a thick white sheet, making the world feel eerily silent. The weather reports had warned it would be bad, but by the time the power cut out, it was clear they had underestimated just how bad. I had just moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It was my first time living alone. Exciting at first, but that night, the isolation felt more like a curse than a dream. I had spent the entire day working a double shift at the diner, serving the holiday crowd, then hauling furniture around in my new place. By the time I looked outside, everything was covered in snow. My yard, the road, even the front steps. It felt like nature was trying to erase my house from existence. I was exhausted, ready to collapse on the couch with a hot drink, when my phone buzzed. The sudden vibration startled me. Just a notification from the neighborhood app. Usually it was full of lost pet alerts and complaints about street parking, but this one was different. Be on the lookout for a suspicious man, seen walking door to door in this area. Police notified. Stay safe. I read it twice. A suspicious man? In this storm? Who in their right mind would be wandering around in weather like this? My stomach twisted. What if he comes here? I told myself it was probably nothing, just some nervous neighbor overreacting, but my gut wouldn't let it go. I went around the house checking all the locks, front door, back door, every window. Just to be safe, I dragged a chair in front of the door and pulled the curtain shut. The power was still out, and without the heater running, the house felt too quiet. The storm outside raged on, rattling the windows, whistling through the cracks. I curled up under a pile of blankets, trying to distract myself with my phone, but the battery was draining fast. And then, it happened. A knock, software deliberate, 3 taps. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't random. It was controlled, intentional. My first thought was that I had imagined it. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. A chill ran down my spine as I crept toward the front door, my legs wobbly. The porch light was out, and when I peeked through the window, all I saw was untouched snow. No footprints. No sign of anyone. My breath caught. How was that possible? The wind howled louder, rattling the glass, and I backed away from the door. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm overthinking. And then, a knock. Not from the front, from the back. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. There was no way anyone could have moved from the front to the back door without leaving tracks in the snow. I grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed to the kitchen, where the back door was. My stomach churned when I saw it, the shadow passing by the window. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. Silence. And then, the slow creak of the door handle turning. I bolted, grabbing the biggest kitchen knife I could find. My heart was pounding as I pressed my back against the wall. I tried calling 911, but the phone had no signal. And then, the sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scrape of metal against the doorframe, like someone was dragging something sharp against the wood. They wanted me to know they weren't leaving. I clutched the knife tighter as the wood splintered. The door burst open, and there he was, a man tall and broad, standing in the doorway. Snow swirled around him. In his hand, something heavy glinted in the faint light. A crowbar. "Get out!" I screamed, waving the knife. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, breathing heavily, tilting his head, like he was deciding something. Then he stepped forward. Adrenaline surged through me, and I shoved the kitchen table into him with all my strength. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to run. I sprinted through the front door, barefoot into the freezing snow. The cold was like a knife against my skin, but I didn't stop. I ran and ran, not daring to look back, until I reached my neighbor's house, a quarter-mile away. The police found him later that night, hiding in the woods. His car was parked nearby, filled with rope, duct tape, and a shovel. They said he'd been watching houses for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The snowstorm, the power outage. It was all part of his plan. I moved out by the end of January. I couldn't stay there after that. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up sure I've heard those knocks again. Soft, deliberate, just enough to make me wonder if someone's out there. Waiting. Story 2. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes. They cling to you, creeping in when the world gets too quiet. For me, it's that night. I used to love snowstorms. They felt like timeouts from life, an excuse to slow down, stay in, and enjoy the stillness. Growing up in the Midwest, we got at least a couple of major storms every winter. I always found them cozy, magical even. I'd wrap myself in a blanket, sip hot cocoa, and listen to the muffled hush of snow piling up outside. It felt safe. But after last winter, I don't think I'll ever feel that way again. The storm that night wasn't anything special at first. The first flakes fell lazily sometime after lunch, drifting down like they had all the time in the world. By evening, the wind had picked up, whipping the snow into swirling patterns under the streetlights. It looked like something out of a Christmas card. Beautiful, peaceful. I was alone that night. My roommate, Mia, had texted earlier to say she wasn't coming home. She'd gotten snowed in at her boyfriend's place, and I didn't blame her. The roads were already a mess, slick with ice and slush. I wasn't worried. I liked my own company, and the house, though old and a little creaky, had always felt like a safe little cocoon. I built a fire in the living room, the kind that snapped and crackled like it was alive. I poured myself a glass of red wine and curled up in my favorite chair with a mystery novel I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, the kind of night that made you grateful to be inside. Then at exactly 9:14 p.m., the power went out. The lights flickered twice, then vanished, plunging the house into darkness. I sighed. Not a huge shock. This house was old, and the wiring had probably been installed when electricity was still a new concept. I grabbed my phone, 40% battery, and used the flashlight to find the emergency candles in the kitchen. I was halfway to the pantry when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I stopped mid-step. The wind outside was loud, but this sound was different. Too controlled, too intentional. I turned toward the front door, my heart thudding in my chest. It's just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a branch fell against the house. But deep down, I knew better. I moved cautiously, my socked feet making no sound on the wooden floor. My breath fogged up the peephole as I leaned in to look outside. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. No footprints. A cold, uneasy feeling crept over me. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the doorknob like a lifeline. I was just about to turn away when it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, slower, heavier. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" Silence. A few seconds passed, then, "Let me in." A man's voice. Calm, steady, too steady. Something about the way he said it made my entire body tense. There was no panic in his tone, no urgency, just expectation. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, heart pounding, fingers gripping the fireplace poker so tightly my knuckles ached. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, forcing my voice to sound strong. Silence. Then, the sound of crunching footsteps moving away. Not leaving, but circling the house. I bolted for the kitchen, gripping my phone with shaking hands. A sudden vibration made me jump. An incoming text from an unknown number. "Megan, why won't you let me in?" My blood turned to ice. How did he know my name? I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then another knock, but not from the front door. From the back. Tap, tap, tap. Then another, and another. Knocking pounded from every side of the house. Front door, back door, windows. Too many all at once. My phone buzzed again. It's so cold out here, I wanted to scream. The knocks grew more frantic, relentless, as if whoever or whatever was outside was done waiting. And then, silence. Just like that. I stayed where I was, my back pressed against the kitchen cabinets, gripping the poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Then, the first hint of daylight crept through the windows. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints. No sign that anyone had ever been there. But on the front door, something had been carved into the wood. See you next time. Story 3. I used to love snowstorms. There was something about the way they silenced the world, muffling every sound under a thick white blanket. Growing up, I always thought of them as peaceful, even comforting. There was nothing better than curling up inside with a warm drink, watching the snow fall outside, safe from the bitter cold. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in a snowstorm again. It was mid-January, and the blizzard had rolled in earlier than expected. By sunset, the roads were nearly impassable, and the snow was piling up fast. The street lamp outside barely cast any light through the swirling white haze. I wasn't worried. I had lived alone for years in my cozy little house on the edge of town. It was an older home, creaky but solid, the kind of place where you could hear every gust of wind rattling the windows. That night, I was curled up on the couch with a book and a cup of tea, wrapped in my favorite blanket. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind howled like something alive, but inside, everything was warm, quiet, peaceful. Then around 8 p.m., I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. I looked up from my book. The sound was faint, almost easy to miss over the howling wind. I frowned. Who would be out in this storm? I set my tea down and listened. A few seconds passed. Then, knock, knock, knock. Louder this time, more distinct. I hesitated, my heart starting to pound. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe snow falling from the roof. Maybe a tree branch knocked loose by the wind. But deep down, I knew better. Gripping my phone, I stood up and crept toward the kitchen, where the back door was. The only light in the room came from the porch lamp outside, casting a dim glow through the frosted window. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look. Nothing. The back porch was empty. Snow covered the ground, untouched, smooth as glass. No footprints. My fingers hovered over the lock. My brain was screaming at me to turn around, to ignore it, to pretend it never happened. Then the knock came again. But this time, it wasn't from outside. It was from inside the house. Every hair on my body stood on end. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The house was silent except for the crackling of the fire in the other room. Then I saw it, a single wet footprint. Right in the middle of my living room rug. It wasn't mine, it was fresh. The edges of the print glistened under the firelight, droplets of melted snow soaking into the fabric. I couldn't move. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. No one else was here, but someone had been. A sudden creak came from upstairs, a slow, deliberate sound. I wasn't alone. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands shaking. My feet felt like lead as I inched toward the staircase. Another creak, closer this time. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart hammering so loudly I thought whoever was upstairs might hear it. I needed to get out. Now I turned and bolted for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, slipping in my panic. Finally, the door swung open, and the icy wind hit me like a slap. I ran, barefoot through the snow, past the porch, down the driveway. I didn't stop until I reached my neighbor's house. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty. No footprints outside, no sign of a break-in. But the footprint on the rug, it was still there. Story 4. You know those nights that never leave you, no matter how much time passes? The kind that sneak up on you when everything gets too quiet, making you relive every detail like it just happened? For me, that night was in December 2018. The storm had been building all day, the kind of blizzard that the news anchors spent the whole week warning about. They told people to stock up, stay indoors, and avoid travel. I should have listened. Ethan, my husband, was stuck at work in the next town over. He called earlier that evening, telling me he'd be leaving soon. But the roads were already bad, and the snow was coming down so fast it was impossible to see a few feet ahead. Just stay at a hotel, I told him. It's not worth the risk. But Ethan was stubborn. He laughed it off, promised he'd take it slow, and swore he'd be home before I knew it. I wasn't happy about it, but arguing with him wasn't going to change anything. So I waited. The house was warm and quiet, the fire in the living room crackling softly. I curled up with a blanket and turned on the TV, flipping through channels, trying to distract myself from the storm outside. I don't know how long I sat there, half listening to some sitcom I wasn't really watching. The snow was piling up outside, sticking to the windows, making the world beyond the glass disappear into a swirling blur of white. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. At first I ignored it. Probably just a tree branch swaying in the wind, but it didn't stop. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The steady, slow drag of something against wood. I muted the TV. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the front porch. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the blanket tight. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe a branch had snapped and was hanging too close to the house. I forced myself to stand up and creep toward the door. Then before I even reached it, knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs. No one should be here. Who would be out in this storm? I forced myself to breathe and inched closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I leaned toward the peephole. What I saw made my stomach drop. A man. He was standing on the porch, hunched against the wind, wearing only a thin shirt and jeans. No coat, no hat. Snowflakes clung to his hair, his clothes soaked through, his skin pale and blue from the cold. He looked like he'd been standing there for hours. His lips parted slightly, and though I couldn't hear him, I saw the faintest fog of breath against the glass. Then he raised a shaking hand and knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. I took a step back. Something wasn't right. Hello, I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. Are you okay? His eyes flicked toward the peephole, like he could hear me. Then he spoke. Please, he whispered. I need help. His voice was barely audible over the storm, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I hesitated. He looked terrible, like he'd been out in the storm for way too long. His body shivered violently, his teeth chattering. But something in my gut screamed, "Don't open the door." I can call someone for you, I offered. Do you need an ambulance? His face twitched. His breath fogged the glass again. Then his tone changed. No, he said sharper this time. Just let me in. A chill crawled up my spine. That's when I saw his hands. At first I thought they were just wet from the snow. Then I saw the dark streaks smeared across his fingers. Thick, dripping. Blood. My breath hitched. My feet moved before my brain caught up. I stepped back from the door, heart hammering so hard it hurt. His face twisted into something unreadable. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, slamming both hands against the door. I screamed and stumbled back. My hands fumbled for my phone, shaking so badly I almost dropped it. 911. Dial. The operator's voice was calm. I was not. There's a man on my porch, I whispered frantically. He's covered in blood, and he won't leave. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, to stay calm, but I could barely think, because the knocking had started again. Bang, bang, bang. I know you're in there, he hissed. I crouched behind the couch, gripping a kitchen knife, my hands slick with sweat. The knocking stopped. Then, footsteps, crunching through the snow, moving around the house. I bit my lip to keep from making a sound. Then from the back door, tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for sirens, praying for anything but what came next. A low chuckle. He was laughing. Then he spoke again. You should have let me in when you had the chance. I clenched my teeth, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles went white. Then, sirens. Flashing lights lit up the snow. I ran to the window just in time to see two officers rushing up the porch. The man didn't run. He just stood there, still, silent, his breath fogging in the cold. They took him away, and later I learned the truth. He had escaped from a psychiatric hospital 10 miles away. His mother, his only caregiver, had died earlier that week. Something about the storm had triggered him, made him believe he was home. He wasn't trying to hurt me, he just wanted to get inside. To this day, I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but every winter when the snow starts to fall, I find myself glancing at the door, just in case. Story 5. You ever have a night that lingers in your mind, refusing to fade no matter how much time passes? A night so unsettling that even years later, a single sound can send you spiraling back to that moment? For me, that night was in January 2018. I had been living alone in a 2-story house just outside the small town of Millhaven. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. The kind of place with creaky floors, drafty windows, and a heating system that only worked when it felt like it. That winter had been brutal, the kind where the snow never stops falling and the wind howls through the trees like a warning. The roads were coated in ice, and every night the sky was swallowed by an endless blizzard. I had just gotten off a 12-hour shift at the hospital, drained to my core. By the time I made it home, I was too exhausted to care about the storm. All I wanted was to curl up under a blanket and forget the world existed. The snow was still coming down hard, the kind that blurs everything outside into a swirling white void. The wind wasn't just whistling through the cracks in the windows, it was screaming. Then, at exactly 8:17 p.m., the power went out. The house was plunged into complete darkness. I sat there for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust, before sighing. Power outages weren't unusual in Millhaven, especially during storms like this. I grabbed my flashlight from the drawer and lit a few candles, their flickering glow casting strange shadows on the walls. I sent a quick text to my mom, letting her know I was okay. 36% battery, not great, but enough to get through the night. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. At first, it was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. Then knock, knock, knock. Louder, more deliberate. My stomach twisted. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. No one should be here. The storm had buried the house in snow. The roads were impassable. Who would be knocking on my back door in weather like this? I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed toward the kitchen, where the back door was. The beam of light cut through the darkness. But when I reached the window, my breath caught. The snow outside was untouched. No footprints. Nothing. My fingers hovered over the lock, my body screaming at me to turn away, to pretend I didn't hear anything. Then, another knock. But this time, it came from the front. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been at the back door had moved. But how? The snow was deep, knee-high in some places. There was no way anyone could have walked around the house without leaving tracks. I backed away from the kitchen and crept toward the front door. My breath fogged the peephole as I leaned in to look outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe the wind had knocked something loose. Maybe a branch had hit the house. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. A message from an unknown number. "Sarah, why won't you let me in?" I felt my entire body go numb. How did they know my name? I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation. A prank? A mistake? Another message. "It's cold out here." I wanted to scream. Then the knocking started again. Not just from the front, not just from the back. It was everywhere, the windows, the walls, the doors. It was coming from all sides. I clamped a hand over my mouth, backing into the corner of the room. My fingers fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to call 911. No service. Of course. The knocking grew faster, more urgent. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. Then, it stopped. Everything fell silent. I stayed curled in the corner for what felt like hours, gripping the fireplace poker with white-knuckled hands. My ears strained for any sound. any hint that whoever or whatever was still outside. Finally, the first streaks of daylight broke through the storm. I forced myself to stand. My legs were weak, shaky, but I had to check. I crept to the window, heart hammering. The snow outside was still untouched. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But on the glass, written in the frost, were 4 words. See you next time. Story 6. You ever have a night that feels like it never really ended? Like a piece of it is still with you, lurking in the corners of your memory, waiting for the right moment to make your skin crawl again? For me, that night was in January 2018. It was a Friday. The snow had been falling since the afternoon, but by sunset it had turned into a full-on blizzard, the kind that wiped the streets clean, erasing footprints within seconds, the kind that swallowed sound, making everything feel wrong. The city had practically shut down. Schools, offices, even grocery stores had closed early. The news had warned that this storm would be brutal, but no one expected it to be this bad. I was home alone. I had just moved into a little 2-story house outside of Ashton, a quiet town where people minded their own business. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it had character. The kind of old house that creaked with every gust of wind, the kind where the floorboards seemed to whisper beneath your feet. At first, the storm didn't bother me. I had stocked up on supplies, charged my phone, and planned to spend the night curled up with a book and some tea. Then at exactly 8:43 p.m., the power went out. The house was plunged into total darkness. I groaned, fumbling for my phone. 28% battery. Not great. I used the flashlight to find the emergency candles in the kitchen. The flickering glow made the house feel strange, like the walls had stretched taller, like the shadows were pressing in. I tried to shake off the feeling. Then I heard it, a knock, faint, software almost polite. It came from the back door. I stiffened, the candle in my hand flickering as my fingers trembled. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind shifting something outside. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was slower, more deliberate. My stomach twisted. I turned toward the kitchen, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. The back door had a small window at the top, but I was too far away to see anything. I hesitated. Then, gripping my phone, I crept closer. The snow outside was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. A chill crept up my spine. I reached for the lock, just to double check, when suddenly, knock, 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 from the front door. My breath caught. Whoever had been at the back had moved to the front. But how? The snow was too deep. I would have seen tracks. I backed away, my hands trembling. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the corner, my fingers clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then, my phone buzzed. I looked down. A text from an unknown number. "Let me in." A lump formed in my throat. Then, another knock. This time it wasn't just the doors, it was the windows. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gas. Knocks came from the front door, the back door, the side windows, everywhere. Panic clawed at my throat. Then through the candlelight, I saw it. A single, wet footprint. Not outside, inside. My chest tightened. I hadn't let anyone in. The doors had been locked. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I needed to get out. Then, I heard the staircase creak. Someone was upstairs. I froze. The floorboards groaned, one step at a time. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, the footsteps stopped. Right outside my bedroom door, I clutched the fireplace poker, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately. I bolted. I ran straight through the front door, into the freezing snow, barefoot and gasping for air. The cold burned my skin, but I didn't stop running. By the time I reached my neighbor's house, my feet were numb, my lungs aching. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched the house, every room, every closet, every inch of the attic and basement. No one was there. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry. But when they checked my phone, they found something that made my stomach drop. The text, "Let me in," wasn't from an unknown number. It was from my own phone. I moved out the next week. I still don't know what happened that night. But sometimes, even now, when the house is quiet and the wind howls just right, I swear I hear footsteps on the stairs. Story 7. You ever have a moment where your gut tells you something is wrong? So wrong that your whole body tenses, your skin prickles, and your brain screams at you to run? I ignored mine that night, and I almost didn't live to regret it. It was a Saturday night in late December, and the storm had started early. By sunset, the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes, piling up so fast the street outside had practically disappeared. I had planned to spend the night alone. My best friend Laura had left town for the holidays, and I was watching over her place, a small rental on the edge of the city. Nothing fancy, but cozy. I didn't mind being by myself. I actually liked the solitude. That changed fast. It started with the power outage. At exactly 7:26 p.m., the lights flickered, once, twice, then everything went dark. I sighed, not too worried. The storm had been raging for hours, and the news had already warned of possible blackouts. I grabbed my phone, 42% battery, and turned on the flashlight. Then, a noise, a soft thump, somewhere upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Laura's cat, Otis, was upstairs. That had to be it, right? I forced myself to relax, shaking my head. You're being paranoid. I walked to the kitchen, feeling my way through the dim candlelight. I had just started heating some water on the gas stove when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap from the front door. I turned, heart pounding. Who the hell would be out in this storm? I hesitated. Then cautiously, I stepped toward the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just swirling snow and the faint glow of the street lamp. I frowned, gripping the doorknob. Maybe a tree branch had knocked against the house. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, more insistent. I swallowed hard. Who's there? No answer. I stood frozen, waiting, my ears straining. The storm howled outside, but other than that, silence. Then, a long, slow scratch ran down the wood of the front door. Every hair on my body stood up. That wasn't the wind. I backed away, my hands suddenly clammy. The candlelight flickered wildly against the walls, making the shadows stretch and twist. Then from the back of the house, bang, bang, bang. I spun around. The back door. Someone or something was knocking on it. My stomach twisted into knots. There was no way someone could have moved from the front door to the back that fast. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to call 911. No signal. Of course, I clutched the kitchen knife, backing toward the hallway. My breathing was shallow, too loud in the silence. Then, I saw it, a set of wet footprints on the hardwood floor, leading from the back door. But they weren't going in. They were going up the stairs. I choked on a gasp. My pulse was a hammer in my chest. Otis was upstairs, but Otis didn't wear shoes. A floorboard creaked above me. Someone was already inside. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the locks, my breath coming in frantic gasps. Behind me, the footsteps started down the stairs. Slow, measured, like they knew they didn't need to hurry. The lock finally turned. I yanked the door open and threw myself into the snow, the cold air slicing through my lungs. I ran barefoot, slipping, stumbling, barely able to see. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house. They called the police. By the time they arrived, the house was empty. No footprints, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. But the front door, it was covered in deep, jagged scratches, like something had been trying to claw its way inside. I never stepped foot in that house again. Laura swore I imagined it, that the storm had messed with my head. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That slow, deliberate tap, 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 like something is still waiting for me to answer. Story 8. It's strange how some nights never leave you. You can move, change your surroundings, even tell yourself it's all in your head. But some memories refuse to fade. For me, that night was in January 2019. The snow had started falling just after noon. At first, it was light, soft, almost peaceful. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, it had turned into a full-blown blizzard. The kind that buries cars, shutters businesses, and makes the world disappear under a thick, endless white. I wasn't home. I was at my sister's house, watching over her place while she was away for work. She lived a little farther out of town than I did, near the edge of the woods, where the houses were spaced far apart, and the only light at night came from the dim, flickering glow of porch lamps. It was quiet, too quiet. At first I liked it. I lit a fire in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, and let the warmth settle into my bones. The storm outside raged on, rattling the windows, but inside everything felt safe. Then at exactly 8:11 p.m., the power went out. The house was swallowed in darkness. I sat up, my heart giving a small, nervous jump. The wind howled outside and the trees groaned under the weight of the snow. I reached for my phone. 22% battery. Not great. Using the flashlight, I found some candles in the kitchen, lighting them one by one. Their flickering glow cast long, swaying shadows across the walls, making the house feel different. That's when I heard it. A noise outside. I turned toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. There, just beyond the porch, stood a man. I froze. He was barely visible through the thick curtain of snow, standing motionless at the edge of the yard. No coat, no hat, just a thin white shirt and dark jeans soaked through, his bare arms covered in ice. His head was tilted slightly, as if he was listening, watching. I swallowed hard. My first thought was that he was stranded. Maybe his car had broken down, and he was looking for help. But something about him felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The way he stood there, completely unaffected by the storm, made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. No service. Of course. I turned back to the window. He was gone. The yard was empty. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe I imagined him. Maybe the storm played tricks on my eyes. Then, knock, knock, knock. I nearly dropped the candle. The front door. I turned, my pulse hammering in my ears. Knock, knock, knock. Software measured. Too patient. I took a step back, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. My throat was dry. Who's there? Silence. The wind howled. The walls creaked. But there was no answer. I swallowed hard, my body rigid with unease. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, crunching through the snow, moving toward the back of the house. My stomach twisted. My mind screamed, run. I darted toward the back door, barely breathing. I checked the lock, secure. Then through the frosted window I saw him, standing just inches from the glass. Closer now. I stumbled back, the candle in my hand shaking. His face was pale, his lips blue, his eyes hollow, not wide, not blinking, just empty. And then, he smiled, a slow, creeping grin that stretched too wide across his frozen face. My chest tightened. Then, the door handle turned. I gasped, grabbing the nearest thing, a kitchen knife. My hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. The handle jerked, once, twice. Then it stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, my entire body locked in place. Then my phone buzzed. I flinched, nearly dropping it. A message from an unknown number. Why did you lock the door? My breath hitched. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the knife tighter, backing away from the door. Then knock, knock, knock. This time, from the window. I turned, my stomach dropping. The footprints outside had changed direction. They were no longer leading away from the house. They were leading inside. I choked back a scream. No one had come in. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. And yet, the footprints trailed across the floor. Wet. Fresh. Leading toward the staircase. I wasn't alone. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock, yanking it open with all the strength I had. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran through the knee-deep snow, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back, not until I reached my neighbor's house. When the police arrived, the house was empty. No broken windows, no forced entry, no signs that anyone had ever been inside. But the front door, the wood was scratched, deep, violent, like something had been trying to claw its way in. I never went back. My sister moved out a month later too. She never told me why. But sometimes when it snows, I swear I hear it. That slow, deliberate knock. 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 Like he's still waiting. Story 9. There are some nights that never leave you. No matter how much time passes, no matter how much you try to forget, they linger. They wait in the quiet moments. They creep up when the wind howls just right, when the shadows stretch too long, when the house settles in a way that doesn't sound quite right. For me, that night was in February 2020. It had been snowing all day. The kind of slow, relentless snowfall that makes the world feel like it's shrinking. By nightfall, the streets were empty, buried under thick drifts of white. The sky was a swirling mass of darkness, and the wind had a strange, hollow sound, like a breath sucked in and never exhaled. I was alone in my new rental house, a small place at the very end of a quiet road. It wasn't much, just a one-story home with old wooden floors and windows that rattled in the wind. But it was mine, and that night I hated it. It started around 9:13 p.m. I had just settled onto the couch, a cup of tea in my hands, the TV murmuring some forgettable show in the background. The storm outside had picked up, the wind lashing against the house. Then the power went out. 1 second the room was warm and flickering with light. The next, total darkness. I sighed, setting my tea down. Great. I reached for my phone. 19% battery. Not great. I turned on the flashlight and made my way to the kitchen, searching for candles. The floor creaked beneath my feet, a deep, aching sound like the house was stretching. Then just as I reached the pantry, knock, knock, knock. I froze. The sound had come from the front door, software rhythmic, patient. The hairs on my arms stood up. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding. Who would be out in this weather? I hesitated, then crept toward the door, my socked feet whispering against the wood. I leaned in, pressing my eye against the peephole. No one. The porch was empty. Snow swirled in the dim light, untouched. My breath hitched. I stood there for a long moment, heart thudding. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe something had fallen against the house. I turned away, then knock, knock, knock. This time, from the back door. I spun, my breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my grip slick with sweat. My legs felt like lead as I made my way toward the back door. Through the small window, I could see the porch light flickering weakly against the snow. And there, a figure, standing just outside the door, tall, motionless, their face hidden in shadow. I stopped breathing. My fingers dug into the handle of the knife. The figure didn't move, didn't shiver, didn't breathe. Then slowly, too slowly, it lifted one hand, and it waved. I stumbled backward, slamming into the counter. My chest squeezed so tight I couldn't breathe. Then, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You forgot to lock the door. My stomach flipped. I turned my head, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The front door was open, wide. The wind howled through the house, sending a shiver of icy air rushing across my skin. I ran. I grabbed the door, my fingers numb with terror, and slammed it shut. My mind was racing. I locked it. I know I locked it, didn't I? Then, footsteps. Not outside, not from the porch, from inside the house. My chest went tight. My ears rang. I turned, gripping the knife with white-knuckled hands. The hallway was dark, too dark. The air was wrong, thick, heavy, pressing down on me. Then, a creak, a slow, deliberate sound. My eyes darted toward the bedroom door at the end of the hall. It was open. I hadn't opened it. I couldn't move. Then, something moved inside. Not a person, something else. A shape, shifting in the shadows. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I sprinted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock, yanking it open so fast I nearly fell outside. The snow burned my skin, but I didn't stop. I ran through the storm, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I didn't look back, not even when I heard it. A voice from inside the house, software amused. I didn't say you could leave. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched everything, every room, every closet, every inch of the house. There was no one there. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry. But on the bedroom door, there were scratches, long, deep, like something had been dragging its nails across the wood. I moved out the next morning. I don't know what was in that house. I don't want to know. But sometimes, even now when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear it. That slow, deliberate knock, 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 like it's still waiting.